Okay, so here we go. Leadership in the now normal. So this is, I didn't say this before, but I was thinking, and Larry first asked me to do this, I think it was 2 years ago, and it was a kind of now normal. And then again in June, and it was a different kind of now normal. And so I've had to keep recreating what is the now normal, which really is just an indicator of how quickly all of this is changing and moving, right? So here we are in the now normal. And so we talked a little bit about, we didn't go too deep in this in the beginning session, but about technical and adaptive leadership, right? And so if we stop and think about what that looks like again, right? Technical stuff is technical challenges are challenges where we know the answer, right? We know what to do. It might be hard, it might be complex, it might be expensive, but we know what to do. There are known experts. There's a solution to the problem, even if we have trouble accessing it. There's a solution to the problem. And adaptive challenges are a completely different animal. So what we're gonna talk about in this workshop is what it looks like to address an adaptive challenge. How do we diagnose one? What do we do with it once we know we've got one? And how might we lead our congregations in addressing this kind of thing? So when I take the term workshop seriously, so feel free at any point to ask questions, to stop and interrupt me, to make comments or offer up things that you know. I have no illusions that I'm the only person in this room who's done this work, or that I'm really even the expert in this, right? This is an opportunity for us to be in conversation. So let's not miss that opportunity. Here we go. So I want to tell you about Zion Lutheran Sunday School. So there was a couple of years ago, I think it was the Southeast Minnesota Synod, I had the gift of working with a pastor she was an associate pastor in her church. Now this is Minnesota, so bear with me. I just rolled my eyes at the time. I think I still do. They had 100 kids in Sunday school, and they were very worried about the significant decline they had experienced. So, yeah, welcome to a whole new world. But they weren't wrong about that, right? She wasn't wrong about that when they looked at the statistics over a 10-year period. Even though 100 kids felt like a full group and it was bustling and alive, right? Like that's critical mass in a good way. They were right in discerning that there was a significant drop off, right? And one of the things that's so smart and what I so appreciated about her was that she said, we have to do something now, right? While we still have energy, while we still have people, while we still have financial resources, right? The time to address these adaptive challenges is before they seem like crises. Now, you eventually get around to dealing with them even when they are crises, but the ideal situation is that you start to understand what's happening and you get ahead of this stuff, right? So what she did was to say, in the last 10 years, here, congregation, look at this, right? In the last 10 years, this is the trajectory, right, of our enrollment in Sunday school. And people were like, oh, yeah, okay, well, that's too bad. And let's just keep moving on, right? She hadn't gotten anybody's attention. And so the next thing she did was, in leadership language, we call this turning up the heat, right? So that we could put on there's a whole graph about turning up heat and all this kind of thing, but we don't need to do that today. But turning up the heat means making a group of people uncomfortable enough that they're willing to do something about the problem, right? So sometimes when you talk about a problem, they're like, well, it's nice that you care about that, and I have a lot to do, and so we'll see you tomorrow, right? Like they just are not going to engage. And so part of the job of leadership is to turn the heat up high enough, right, to create enough anxiety in the system. Anxiety is actually a good thing in a system, right? You want a little bit of anxiety so that people are willing to work on the problem. So what she did was she filmed a Sunday school kid who had, she had like cards, right, that she held up, and she said, and the card said, in 2015, we had this many kids in Sunday school. and she pushed that, in 2000 and whatever, 20, we had this many kids in Sunday school. She said, in 2025, if nothing changes, we'll have this many, right? And in 2030, we'll have nobody, right? Like whatever the trajectory was. I don't know what the numbers are, right? And that told the story in a different way, right? To see a young person telling that story and to project it out, right? If we don't do anything, this is where we're going to land. That got their attention, right? Now suddenly there's enough heat in the system, there's enough anxiety in the system. They're like, okay, well, we better do something about this, right? So part of the job is just to raise the level of anxiety in the system, right? So we talked about this, right? So technical challenges addressed by experts and adaptive are complex with no clear answers. Now, why do I bring this up at this juncture, right? Well, it's important, really important, to distinguish what is an adaptive and what's a technical challenge. So let me give you an example. And often when we're dealing with these kinds of things, it's a combination of both. And so part of your work is to extract out the technical elements of it and deal with the adaptive stuff. So so a good friend of mine who started as a parish pastor in a new call, he got to the church, and it was a big church, and they had a preschool, and it was hi Terry, come on in. It was a fairly young church, that is to say about 30 years old, big thriving church, young church. But what that meant was that they had members who had keys, right? So when this started with just a handful of people, everybody had a key, right? And so as they built buildings and so on and so forth, they just kept giving people keys. Well, if you have a preschool, you can't have 50 keys out there, right? That's a huge risk management issues. So this pastor started in the congregation, and the church council said, one of the things we need to do is just get a new lock system. It's all budgeted for. And so he thought, okay, no problem. So he worked with the facilities people and called in a locksmith, and they came and changed all the locks, and, they put in a fancy new kind of key fob system, and then they could code, right? The fobs and all this kind of thing. Now that looks on the surface of things like a technical challenge, right? Need a new lock system, it's risk management, you change the locks, job done, right? What happened? Right? It turned into an adaptive challenge really fast, right? Because suddenly you had all these people with their keys that couldn't get in the building, right? And there's a logical explanation for that, and a really good one, right? This is risk management. This is about the safety of the children who are in our preschool. Really important part. Well, Pastor, I would never hurt a child.
Yeah, right.
Right? You can hear this, right? Well, of course not. That's not what we don't think that, our lifelong members are going to hurt children, although we have to be careful, right? We don't ever really know sometimes. This is why we do this kind of stuff. So suddenly he had what was an adaptive challenge on his hands, right? So this is a change in people's priorities, beliefs, habits, right? So suddenly he had to deal with this problem about the locks in an entirely new way. Do you hear that? You hear the shift, right? So oftentimes what we do, which is what he did, and I've done this 100 times over, right? Is that you have a problem, a challenge before you. You think it's a technical one. You bring a technical solution to bear on the challenge, and it creates an even bigger problem, right? So that's why this work of distinguishing which kind of challenge is which and knowing how to address it becomes a really important piece, okay? So if you just stop to think, is this technical or is there an adaptive element to this? So let me stop. Are there situations or things you're thinking of as I tell that story, you're going, oh yeah, we've been there. Anybody got a story about that they want to share?
We're in the middle of this exact same.
Oh,
example.
with the keys.
The keys, yes.
Yeah, okay.
And we know that it's not technical only. I mean, there are technical things that will come up, but it's the adaptive. it's the perception of people that have had this. It's not just, we've always done it this way, but why are you taking this away from me?
Right. It feels
So it's an
punitive.
ownership,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So,
Right. So all of a sudden people's feelings are getting hurt, and okay. So we've all been here. So if you can at least know what you're up against, that's the first thing, right? So how do we distinguish these one from the other? And then how do you address one, right? So do you remember what we said a little bit about this. I don't know why I must have put that fancy little thing in there where I could surprise you with experimentation, but there you go. So adaptive challenges, right, are addressed by way of experimentation. So our friend back at Zion Lutheran Church, she raised the level of heat enough in her congregation, and so they were ready to try something new, right? And of course, they had had Sunday school, for as long as anybody could remember, and the Sunday school superintendent had done this work for 25 years. And of course, they had teachers that had taught for years and years that, grown people now were coming back as teachers who had been children in their classrooms, right? This kind of thing. Beautiful tradition, right? Lots and lots and lots to love and celebrate there. Like lots of people learned the stories of the Bible and learned about what it meant to be a Lutheran and learned how to serve and to love in ways that they wouldn't have without this whole system of Sunday school, right? Beautiful thing. And so she knew before she dug into experimenting on all of this that she had this kind of adaptive challenge, right? So she was really brilliant at this work. So she said, one of the things we have to do is celebrate what has been. So she started by organizing, and this is a lot of work, right? She started by organizing, and they took videos of adults in the congregation and community who had been children coming up through that Sunday school program. And they took video of them talking about what those days had meant to them. And of course, these were touching stories and funny stories and all the stories we probably have about Sunday school, right? And then they threw a huge celebration in the fellowship hall after church one day, and they played these videos and they honored the person who was the superintendent and the school teachers and so on and so forth. Why? Because the work they did was valuable, it was important, it was critical. It's not that they have done something wrong, but what we've been doing isn't working anymore, and we have to try something new, right? So it's not about shaming or blaming or pointing fingers, but this is the job of the leader to create the narrative, right? So the narrative is not that the Sunday school people are bad and they just want to keep, fill in the blank, right? You know all of these tapes in your head, right? But how do we celebrate what has been by way of saying we're closing this chapter and we're celebrating what has been so that we can start into something new. So she did a beautiful job of this. And then she built something that they were going to try just for about 3 months. And she called it Faith Formation 1.0. Now, what does the 1.0 tell you?
There's more to come.
Yeah, right. It's like my cell phone, right? Like I'm on version 13 or 14 or something. I don't know, of an iPhone. But it tells you a couple of things, right? There's more to come, right? It tells you we haven't got it all figured out, but we're going to try something. And it gives you room, right? Like it gives you some permission to say, we're going to try this thing. We don't have any idea if this is going to work or not. And it may completely fall on its head and we have to start over. We're going to try something, right? So just that little 1.0, right? Helps that, gives them some permission to just try. Just wing out a little bit and do something. Yeah, please.
I think so did the term faith formation, because the term Sunday school conjures up a whole bunch of memories and images that, well,
Yeah.
may or may not work now.
Yeah, exactly, right? So that, like, what we call this matters, and I think you're really right about that, right? It has, or we call it Lutheran League, right? It conjures a particular format and way that we do this kind of thing, right? It just, you hear those terms with which we're familiar, and it operates on us in ways we're not even cognitive of, right? It sets in motion a whole way of being. So she called it Faith Formation 1.0, right? And so they tried some new things. Now, there were still people that were mad, and that's okay, right? That's just how that's going to go. There are going to be people who just are resistant to change. So we talked earlier about creating a small group of people with whom to lead change, which she had done that. And so what I've noticed about leading lots of change over the years is that there's usually a group of early adopters, right? And those are the people you're kind of looking for. People like me that kind of thrive on change, right? Now I happen to know Dr. Cray is one of those people too, right? Like we're kindred spirits in that way, right? Like we like change. There are people that like it, that kind of thrive in that environment. And there are people who can and will get on board and move with you. And then there are people that just, their job is to conserve. And in some ways we need those people, right? Like that, it doesn't mean that they're bad people, but they're going to have a really hard time getting on board with a lot of changes. And that's okay, right? So when I was at Wartburg Seminary, I had this really just great idea, and we had worked on this thing and prayed a lot and blah, blah, blah. And I walked into a faculty meeting and I was super excited about this. And I was like, hey, I've got this great idea. And I laid it out there, and they were all like, and and so one faculty member raises his hand and he says, well, there's this and this and this and this and this, right? It was like a wet blanket. Right? Like all of the potential problems, like he could see everything that had gone wrong. Well, after that meeting, I called my mentor and I said, this is what happened. And he said, oh, thank God. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, did you not just hear me? And he says, thank God. He said, you have an Eeyore. I was like, a what? He says, you have an Eeyore. He goes, this is what you do with an Eeyore. He said, they're actually really helpful people. He said, you bring an Eeyore into your office and you sit down with a notepad and a pen like this. Can I show them yours? Yeah. Like this, right? You take out a notepad and a pen like this and you sit down with Eeyore and you say, okay, tell me all the possible roadblocks you can think of as we move forward with this idea. Right? Because, and what my mentor said was, this person's going to see things you will never see because you don't want to see it, right? Like, and so I learned who those people were, right? They didn't always love what we were doing, but they were really good at seeing what the roadblocks were so that we could be prepared for things, right? They knew the people who were going to be mad if we did this. They knew like what systems and structures we were going to bump up against. And they could lay that out. And he said, and so my mentor says this, at the end of the conversation, this is what you say. Thank you so much for helping me understand all the potential roadblocks that are here. This is really going to help us in moving forward. Isn't that great? Isn't that great? Right. We're not going to stop because there are challenges. Because every new piece has challenges, right? But so there are, this is my point, right? So there are people at the top who are ready for change, right? That are eager, excited, that can lead it, they're going to be like your golden retrievers, right? Let's go, right? And then there are people in the middle who you will work with to get on board. They'll come along. And then there are people at the bottom that just are not wired for it, right? They're just wired to hold the center, to hold the tradition, to hold what has been. And those are your Eeyores, right? So you get out your notebook and you work with them and you keep loving on them, right? The worst thing we can do is ostracize people in the midst of this. But you keep loving on them and you keep saying, I know we disagree and I love you and we're going to keep doing this. How can I help you walk? How can we walk together in this, right?
I remember hearing once to always remember that all change involves loss.
Yeah.
And to remember
Yeah.
that, to expect that. And
Yes.
Change is messy.
Yes. So this is what happened. This is the other thing that happens in those kind of meetings, right? I mean, I go in with my great new idea, but what that means is that somebody else's great idea from 20 years ago is now going under. Right? So they're experiencing that emotion. And so this is hard work that I have had to learn over and over again, because I get really excited. I mean, I wake up with 100 new ideas before breakfast, right? Like, I love ideas. I love thinking about possibilities, and I love moving in them. But I've had to learn the hard way that almost nobody else matches me in that, except for Phil. So knowing how to respect and work with and listen to and be compassionate toward people who are not ready and who may never get on board with it is really an important part of that change leadership. Yeah, please, Phil.
I was in a certificate program at Johns Hopkins University called Community and Systems Change for a whole year. And the single message they wanted to give us was that you need to value resistance.
Yeah, good.
When you
Yeah.
try to change an institution.
Yeah.
Because resistance represents values.
Oh, that's good. I haven't heard that before. That's really good. Did you say that again? Resistance?
When you try to change an
Yeah.
institution, right, and you get resistance, you need to pay attention to it and appreciate it, because resistance represents deep value.
Yeah, so it surfaces what a community really holds dear. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Yeah, Heidi, please.
So Phil, did they tell you what to do then when the resistance is I buy that, it indicates that the values are, but what if the values are something that we would hope they would let go of?
Right, it doesn't necessarily mean the values are appropriate for the new situation, but you have to recognize them as values and not as Louise is saying, disregard them.
Right. My tendency, right, when I bump up against, like when that happened in that faculty meeting, and the one faculty member who I really loved, right, was like, well, this and this and this and this, all these things could go wrong, and it's, therefore it's a bad idea and we shouldn't do it, right? That felt personal to me, right? Like, I was like, he doesn't like me, right? That's where I go, and I have to, like that's the internal work that I have to do all the time, right? And so understanding, right, that when resistance comes, this isn't about you. It just isn't about you, right? There's a whole lot of other things operating in a system that can be helpful if you can get out of that, like, this is about me, and pay attention to what's happening in the system. Like, you're going to learn a lot about values. Somebody's going to reveal to you some of the really difficult and bumpy places that are ahead, that if you know them, you can get ahead of them, right? So one of the things that this young woman did, who was leading the Faith Formation 1.0, was she had been around a while, but she asked who the stakeholders were, right? And who were the people in the congregation that they already knew were going to be upset by this, right? You don't even have to, like, announce it the first time. You just know, right? This is not going to sit well with this person. And she took 30 people out to lunch, right? Out for coffee, to say, I want to let you know ahead of time this is going to happen. And I know this has been an important ministry to you, and I want you to hear clearly from me how much we value you and how much we value the work you did and the ministry you have been about. And I want to just be really careful about saying to you, this is not because something is wrong or something's missing or we don't like you, right? Just to do that. And we may disagree about this, right? And she talked about having these coffee conversations where they agreed to disagree, right? Not everybody got on board with that, but at least those people didn't go away thinking, well, the pastor, that young new pastor decided she didn't like me, right? That you take that off the table, right? When you have those kinds of conversations and you care enough to say to somebody, right, I really value you even though we disagree about this. It's a really important part. Yeah, Terry, please.
I do interim consulting for pastoral transitions. Interesting, as a layperson, the common thing now is that they know they have to go to a part-time pastor. They know that.
Yeah.
They don't.
Yeah.
The finance person or the council knows that.
Yeah.
So they're kind of making a decision and proceeding through the transition.
Yeah.
Kind of where you end. What do you need? What do you
Yeah.
want?
Yeah.
That exercise is done. Now it is, we're gonna get a part-time pastor, share that pastor, and probably have to change our worship time.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about transition and really affecting people, and we're just starting that process with this one congregation. So enlighten me. How do I find out who's gonna leave because they don't like the hours changes, and do you ask that question, or do you just kind of tell it like it is?
Yeah. I mean, I might, that's a tougher situation, right? Because you're not part of the community that you're entering into. Yeah. So I mean, I might sit down with some of the congregational leaders and say, who do we know in the congregation who might particularly be affected by this, and could we find some time to just visit with that person before we announce all this? Right? It's about being respectful of people in their, in terms of what they believe and how they feel and think about things. Like, I'm just a big believer that we can actually be in community together and disagree with one another. Right? And that sounds more and more radical in our world as we go forward, right? Like, that used to be sort of the norm, and now it seems like if I disagree with you, I can't be in relationship to you, right? Like, I gotta Facebook shame you and cut you out of my life and cancel you and all this sort of thing, right? Like, this is the world we're in. And so that, like, what a radical thing to be able to do. But that's how I do it. It's just to start. And sometimes you're just not going to know. You're not going to be able to get ahead of that. But if you can, that's a really good thing to do. Other thoughts or questions at this juncture? Oh, yeah, please. I'm sorry.
Our church had done some, when we weren't in the building yet, some outdoor services.
Yeah.
And there were some people who really, really loved that, especially families with little kids.
Yeah.
They didn't have a vaccine then. And then the second summer, it's like, what are we gonna do? Like, do you add a whole new service for 3 people? Because you gotta be, can't think of the word.
Steward resources, right?
Yeah, of your pastor's time
Yep.
and everybody.
Yep.
So we did a poll, like they sent out an email, people who didn't have email, they sent them letters. And so that everybody got to, if you did this, I would come to this, or I won't come to this, and had like different times and things. I don't know if that would be helpful, but we felt as a member of council that at least we were giving people the chance to share their voice so that they felt like they were heard. And then there were some private conversations, when things didn't line up the way somebody wanted, that, council members or the pastor reached out to that person and said, well, this is what we know you felt very strongly, but you're in the minority, and this is what's gonna happen. So maybe just, that might be an idea with your church to, suggest the different times and so people feel heard.
And chances are they're gonna have to find the pastor first. What church are they sharing it with? What's the time of that church, and how are we gonna fit it in?
A lot of unknowns.
Yeah, there's gonna be a lot of unknowns, and that's scary and makes people resist to begin with.
Yeah. The other thing I'd say is that don't send out a survey like that if you're not willing to follow it.
Right.
So you see this happen all the time. People are like, oh, I want them to feel heard. And so we'll ask what people, and then they don't like what they get. And so they're going to do it. They're like, don't do that, right? Like, I'd rather you be an autocrat than to like ask for people's input and then not listen to it, right? So you have to be really careful about when you're asking, who you're asking, and whether or not you're willing to follow. It can be a good tool, but it's not always the best if you're not willing to follow along with what people come up with. Let's move on. Okay. So we talked a little bit about this, right? Discern and build a team. First of all, you don't need everybody on board, but a solid core of willing people, willing disciples, right? So when we made major changes at Wartburg Seminary, I had a group of 6 or 8 people, and I knew they would follow me into traffic and, over the cliff and so on and so forth. And I trusted their opinions. And when they said stop, I stopped. And when they said, be careful, I was careful, and so on and so forth, right? They were the team with whom I was able to move and grow. Yeah, John, please.
Louise, I think that's so important to have to find people in your congregation that
Yeah.
can do people and are willing to step forward, even when so many others might have questions and reservations and might even just want not to do anything.
Yeah.
Our email program at Emmanuel Lutheran Church started the same way.
Yeah,
It
good.
was in March of 2019.
Yeah.
When Governor Wolf announced that all the businesses were going to have to close. I believe the date was March 13th was the date.
Wow.
So I gathered a few people at Emmanuel who I knew would be interested in doing something. Instead of shutting everything down and saying we can't do anything, I asked this group of about 8 people, what can you do?
Yeah.
And we came up with a very simple idea of, well, maybe we can be there for people who are going to lose their jobs and be thrust into a situation of food insecurity as a result of the pandemic. And we opened our back door the following Monday. So this happened over 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
But it came from not asking everybody in the congregation what we could do and listening to all the things that people would have told us not to do. It came from the spirit of these 8 people.
Yeah.
And one of whom reached into his pocket that day and pulled out $400 in cash.
Yep.
And said,
Yeah, you'll get that too. Yeah.
And then we started, and I like to say it was successful before anybody even knew we were doing it.
Yep. Yeah, thank you, John. That's a great example of this, right?
3 years later, we've handed out 325,000.
Yep. It's really important this not to sidestep or triangulate your church council, right? They have a particular role. This is a different role, right? So what you want to do is have the church council authorize a group like this and understand that they work together in it. And maybe there's some connection, like there's a liaison from council and so on and so forth. But it's just a different kind of leadership. And sometimes it's helpful to have this other kind of group to work with. So invite your council to authorize and pray for this work. Pray for God to stir in the hearts of those you need. Pray for eyes to see. We talked about that too. Issue broad and personal invitations. So if I were going to do this in a group, I would say, look, I'm looking for some people who might be willing to think with me about what the next era of Sunday school and faith formation look like. If that's something that sounds interesting to you, talk to me after worship, right? And then I might spend some time in prayer and discernment, and I might say, hey, I think you might be a really good person for this work. And I know you've maybe never thought about yourself in that way, but here's what I see and here's why I think that could be good. Would you be willing to consider that, right? So both broad and personal invitations, right? So as you discern who it is that you feel is being called to this work, and issue those broad invitations. And sometimes there'll be strange people that you don't expect. Now, it's important to not take everybody that comes your way. So, I mean, I think if we dug a little deeper with John, what we'd learn is that, right, what's important is not to get there are some people that want to see everything change because they just don't like the people who are in charge, right? Like it's a personal thing, right? And that you do not want those people in, right? So this is why I talk about spiritually mature people, emotionally mature people who are able to say, we're going to love people through this. We're going to love people through even the grumpy ones, right? We're going to keep holding on and we're going to walk through this together. Right? You don't want the people that are like, oh, those people are so dumb and we don't want them and we have to stop them from doing what they're doing, right? You're not creating division and factions, right? But you want the people who can keep loving but see, right? Can see that future on the horizon. And then please,
just
Mark.
Going back a half step, the discerning and building a team is to address a particular adaptive, as opposed to saying we have counsel and we also need an adaptive challenge team in the church.
I mean, I think you could do it either way. I think you probably have a better sense of that because I don't actually lead congregations right now. So I think it just depends. I tend to do these adaptive challenge by adaptive challenge because I think they're different people that enter well and they're likely crossover in some of that, but yeah, that's how I would think about it. but you might be able to just pull together a group of people that, when I worked with the Lead out of Texas, we ran a program called the Lead Journey, which is just excellent. And that's for congregational leaders. So and this is part of where this comes from, right? So they help lead, we would help them, a congregation discern a group like this. And then they would lead that sort of change in the congregation's trajectory and work over the course.
Lunch is running late,
Okay.
which means you can run on and on.
That's not really good news for them, Mike. Give me a time frame.
How late?
Brian didn't say, just don't rush out,
Okay. So, where was I with all that? It is a technical challenge, exactly, right? It might become adaptive for you all, though. How do we get her to shut up? Anyway, so I don't know where I was, in the middle of some thought there. Anyway, okay, but lunch will be late. There we go. Invite them first into deepening discipleship before you invite them into leadership, right? This is a good friend of mine who taught me this work. Lead Journey, yeah. So Lead Journey, they work with you to build this team, and then that team walks with you and the congregation through a 3-year process. So it's really a kind of a long journey, but you're looking again at the congregation's mission, vision, values. You're trying and experimenting. They help you like reach out into the neighborhood and learn how to do that, and then help you run experiments and then learn where the next trajectory of the congregation is. So that's a big adaptive challenge of the congregation, but that's a long process that they walk through. So I highly recommend it. It's a great process. So sometimes if you invited a broader group to say, hey, come read scripture with me, who's willing to do that, right? Who's willing to step in and grow in their faith and discipleship, and then to see who out of that, right, emerges into leadership. Sometimes that's an interesting way to go about this too. Okay, thoughts or questions here? Begin by listening to those who have been part of the existing ministries. We talked about that. Those who have chosen not to be. Sometimes you learn a lot, right? If what you're trying to sort out is, the Sunday school program, and there are parents with kids that refuse to bring their kids or just tried and it doesn't work, they're good people to talk to too. Why is it? Why didn't it work for you? What can we learn from that experience, right? So just have some conversations with them, learn about what's going on. Those who are prospective participants, right? I cannot say this enough times. So many times as the church, we sit back and we call a group of people who've been part of the church forever and we say, what do those people need? And we come up with some ideas and we spend a lot of time planning and executing these ideas, and then we get disappointed when those people are not interested in what we have come up with, right? So, and when you say it out loud, you realize how ridiculous it is, but I still find myself doing this, right? I have to like correct myself over and over and over again. Nope, we actually have to talk to the people with whom we want to be engaged. So if it's, if you're creating a new faith formation program, you're going to want to talk to the local school teachers. And you're going to want to talk to parents of those kids in the local schools. And you're going to want to figure out how to talk to the, parks and rec programs that go well. And you're going to want to talk to kids. There's an idea, right? If it's for them, like, let's actually talk to kids and see what might be interesting to them. And it's hard, right? Because sometimes when you ask the question, do you have this great idea in mind? And they're like, yeah, no, that's not that interesting to me. I'd rather do this thing over here. And you're like, I don't even know if that makes sense for a church to do that, right? And so it pushes us into some uncomfortable spaces. And then other stakeholders, right? Who are other people that could help you if you talk to them. And this is, again, one of those things I learned from Lead. Don't just have one conversation, right? Have an initial conversation and set up the contract so that you're coming back for 2 or 3. conversations, right? Because those conversations are going to deepen over time, right? Questions or thoughts here? Okay. Discerning the best paths forward. I love that picture, right? Like, oh man. So I think the important word here is that paths is plural. Right? So I always have to like disavow myself that there is one right answer. Right? There are probably 10 right answers to any of these situations, right? There are clever and interesting things that congregations can do to engage new people all over the place, and the different ones are going to work in different congregations. That's why I'm not here going, hey, do these 10 things and your congregation will be successful, right? Because that's not how this looks these days, right? And we know what works in one congregation may not work in the next one. It might, but it might not, depending on the context, right? Like you're hearing me talk about Zion Lutheran Church in southeastern Minnesota Synod that has 100 kids in Sunday school, right? That's not the story in Pennsylvania, right? And that's okay, right? There's value in the kind of ministry that happens in Pennsylvania, right? This is not about good or bad, but this is just about understanding that context matters, right? So discerning the best paths forward are about identifying several good paths and then saying, what are the best three, right? If we could accomplish these things, we think it would make a huge difference, right? So we're going to say, we want young people in our congregation to grow in faith. And we're going to know they've grown in faith by blah, 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 right? You're going to want to measure this. And then, what if we did it, do we think would make the biggest difference, right? Whether that's setting up a mentoring program or creating an app on your phone or whatever that looks like, right? What are your three best ways to get at that? And what have you talked to kids about, right? What are they interested in? What are their parents interested in? What are their parents willing to do? Bring them to, right? Spend that energy on. And then these are the ones you want to pursue, right? So you've probably got to weed some out. So then you're going to design a 12-week experiment to test idea number one. But take your best idea. Now, 12 weeks is a really important thing. If you could do it in less than 12 weeks, amen. I'm working at the church-wide organization on this because we have a tendency to do long, protracted plans with a lot of budgets and staffing. And so I've built a group now that just tests ideas in 12 weeks or less. And boy, that has been a hard road to hoe, right? Like that is really tough for us as planners in the Lutheran tradition, is that we don't like this kind of quick. So it's not going to be all pinned together and neat. It's not going to be as well laid out or scheduled or planned as you probably would like it to be. And this is why we call it 1.0, right? You're going to be really transparent with your congregation that we're just trying something, right? It's going to be a little chaotic and we're not sure how it's going to go. And, you want to keep everybody safe, but within those boundaries, right? Like it's okay if the edges are a little frayed. That's okay. Get the buy-in and support of the church council. Plan for your experiment. So what kind of budget do you need? What's the timeline? What kind of staffing or volunteers? Communication, supplies, and then criteria for evaluation. Okay, so think ahead about some things so that you know what it is that you're looking for. Thoughts or questions here? Yeah, Phil, please.
One of the things I find that congregations tend to do is all of those steps except marketing at the very end.
Gosh, right?
Then they're disappointed when so few people show up.
Yeah.
But everybody spends all their time getting everything right, including how many cookies are going to be served.
It's true.
Right?
Yeah.
And then, it's like, oh, somebody's got to market this.
Yeah. So any change initiative that you're doing, right, like running one of these experiments, the data indicates that you have to communicate it 10 times more than you would any other thing in your congregation. I was going to get to that. That's a great segue, right? 10 times more. So it's going to feel exhausting and really redundant to you, but 10 times more than you would some normal thing, right? Because it's a shift, it's a change, right? I was, when I was a parish pastor in Iowa, I was pastor of a little congregation that what we call a family-sized church, right? And a little congregation, and I showed up on June on a Sunday morning, and I got there at 9:30 for a 10 o'clock service, and the council president met me at the door, and he was not happy. And this is what he says to me. He says, "We've already sung all the hymns." And I'm like, and this is, you know how like realization comes from the back of your brain forward, right? Like this, I'm like, oh yeah, there were a lot of cars in the parking lot for 9:30 in the morning, right? And so every year for as long as they could remember. And the first Sunday in June, they switched to 9 o'clock worship, not 10 o'clock. They just didn't tell me that, right? Like you just should know this by osmosis since you are the pastor here, right? Classic. And they were not amused. I mean, I was trying humor. I mean, I had all my best bits worked up and they were not amused. So communication is really key in all of this. Really key. Yeah, please.
Make it a part of your meetings too. Like at our council meetings, one of the last things we do is
Beautiful.
communication corner. All right, let's review what's being communicated.
I love that.
Who's responsible for it?
We do that too.
You know, just, and it's part of
I
the
love
it's part of
that.
the agenda. So that way it's a recap, you know, it's not just, okay, who's gonna tell the secretary to send this out? Who's gonna post this on the website? Who's gonna do this? Because it's not just what are you communicating, it's who's going to communicate it to make sure it actually gets done.
That's brilliant. I'm totally stealing that idea. Communication corner, right? That's great. I'm terrible at this. I think if it happens in my brain, everybody knows about it, right? Like I'm terrible at this, right? Like I mean, I literally will say to my friends sometimes, didn't I say that out loud? Like, nope, it just went through my head, right? And I just like discerning what I've said out loud and what just happened.
3 different times because you forgot you told them.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, right here. Communication corner for those of you who are like us. Prepare your congregation. So frame the conversation. We've talked about this, right? Talk about how the world has changed around you. Not that they got it wrong, right? The blame does not help anybody at this point, right? And how you now need to do things differently for the sake of upcoming generations. Celebrate the wonderful work that happened in Sunday school. Work with your community's leadership to lean deeply into your mission, align your congregation's time, money, and calendar, right? So this is once you've run some experiments and you know where it is you're headed, right? Then this is about aligning all those resources and getting on board with it. We could do 7 more sessions on that sentence alone. Over communicate change initiatives. They take 10 times the amount of communication at other things too. Yeah, please.
It's nice to see you again.
You too. Hi.
So that's where I actually have a question or comment.
Yeah, sure.
Long story short, I tried to do something different in a very small congregation that I'm in, where I wanted to try one intergenerational faith formation type
Yeah.
event.
Yeah.
There's not much going on, youth-wise there at all right now, but I have some adults who are good that in the faith formation in their faith formation program, and well, anyway, long story short, this thing about the budget and the supplies and so forth, but if you set your budget a year in advance, now you try to do something different, and everybody, the first thing they say is, there's no money to buy supplies.
Yeah.
Or there's
Yep.
no
Yep.
money to do that at all.
Yep.
And we did run into that now. So I was going to ask you, do you have like a experimentation budget or,
It's a great question. Yes, I do. Yes, absolutely. So both at Wartburg and now at the churchwide organization, I'm managing to accomplish some of this, right? So how do we set aside a particular amount of money? And this it's really tough, right? Because for good reason, we have planners and financial people who are serious about financial controls. And that's a really important thing in a congregation, right? So I hear me clearly, but part of what I've called it in both places an innovation fund, right? So what we agree on with leadership, right? So I did this with the board. What we agree on are a set of values that kind of hold the center of how we can spend that money. But you have to be more nimble, right? So year-long planning, year-long budgeting, right? You miss opportunities to respond to things that are happening in your community. So if you've got an innovation budget or whatever you want to call it, right, and you've got some money set aside for that, sometimes the first, like what's happening at Churchwide now is that it's not part of the central budget, but it's a restricted gift that was set aside for missional ideas, right? So it fits really well, missional ideas and innovation, right? So and I've fortunately the treasurer is a great person, so she's helping me put some more money in that and fundraising and so on and so forth. So there are ways to kind of get some money into that budget. And you actually, what I'm finding is you don't need a whole lot of money up front. Like it's down the road that you tend to need, once you've run some experiments and if you land on a good idea, that's when you really need some serious funding. That to me is the challenging part of this. So I have some meetings set up now with somebody who's a venture capitalist, because I want to learn how to speak the language, right? So I'm in front of donors that have high capacity to fund this kind of thing. But I'm like, well, if I come up with a good idea, can you give me some money for it, right? Like, and that doesn't, surprisingly, they're saying no to that. So I don't know why, but anyway, so it's about it, you've got to, and the other thing I found in all this too is that, like, you probably discovered this in COVID, right? That like monthly, you had to make decisions more quickly than a monthly council meeting. Right. So this is what we didn't go too far into this, but the systems and structures of typical congregational decision making and planning just don't function in the world we're in. Right. We had to do this at the seminary, right? We had 2 meetings a year with the seminary board. Well, when I got there, the budget was underwater. We had failed. We had underperformed in a fundraising campaign. We had 19 incoming students, right? It was terrible. So all of the financial measures of the seminary were just in the toilet. And I had to wait 6 months to talk to the board about something that I thought we needed to do, right? It was too long, right? So we worked to have, more frequent meetings, and we had interim decision-making bodies and so you may find that you have to create some of those kinds of measures if you haven't already, as well as the budgeting piece. So we're just in a time where we need more nimble decision-making and leadership processes. Yeah, a great question. Thank you. Prepare yourself. This is a really important one that I get so involved with. How am I stewarding other people that I forget to sometimes prepare myself for what I'm heading into. So I know I'm saying this a lot, but pray, align your calendar and work. So one of the things I'm doing right now at the Churchwide organization is because I've got I have a really strange job description. So on any given day, I might be dealing with a leak on the 6th floor, or I might be talking with a synod about how we run an experiment with the foster system through Lutheran Social Services and work with congregations to support that, right? Like, so and the breadth of that and everything in between. So I'm continuing. So every 6 months, I go through my calendar and I log what did I pay attention to? Where did I spend my time? Where were my meetings, right? And how does that align with what I want to accomplish? Right? And oftentimes I've spent time on all kinds of things that have nothing to do with what I'm really called there to do. And so then I sit down with my supervisor and I say to her, here are the things I think I need to let go of in order, because I'm not spending the kind of time on these things that you want me to. And so we work through that, right? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes no, we still need you to do that. Okay. But I'm constantly doing that with my calendar so that my work, that my time and energy are aligned with what I want to accomplish. And I would suggest the same for your congregation's calendar. Right? And that's a really tough one, but that's a really important piece to align. And then, read scripture. I don't know if you heard me say that yet, but anyway, that's an important one. And then take care of your body. Eat, sleep, drink water, take a Sabbath, right? Like actually get some rest, get some time away. Evaluate. I can't say this enough, right? Evaluating what we've done. Again, this is one I have to really push myself on because I think I've got it evaluated in my head, but having that process in place is really important. What were your criteria for evaluation? Did you meet them? What went well? What didn't? You can come up with these questions. These aren't rocket science, right? What surprises were there? And then I had a really great colleague at Wartburg who helped us design this process. We called them EAT teams. Evaluation assessment teams, right? So, experiment assessment teams. So we pulled stakeholders that had been part of the experiment, people who were the part of the ministries and so on and so forth. And so a small group of people, we limited those conversations to an hour. This doesn't have to be a long, protracted process. We limited those conversations to an hour, and at the end we had a forced decision. Are we going to try it again with some tweaks, or are we going to stop doing it, or are we going to redevelop something else altogether out of this, right? So there were one of three ways we could go, and the group had to decide which way we were going because they had been part of it. They were stakeholders in it, right? So really important way to do it. And then we could show that, right? So we could show that to our board, right? These are the experiments we've run. This is the decision we made about them. And this is where our work and energy are going again. So having that kind of process in place was really important. It was like a decision tree, right? Share what you've learned, especially if you've failed. It gives people in your organization all kinds of permission. Share it with your leadership, with those who participated in the experiment, with those whom you interviewed, right? So if you started out working on a faith formation program and you interviewed teachers, either in writing or, again, take somebody out to coffee and say, hey, I really want to thank you. Here's what happened. Share that learning back, right? Because it lets them know you respect their input, you value it, and you might just learn something more from it, right? And then they become a stakeholder in what's going on. They get interested and involved in this. And then, of course, with your congregation. And then finally, right? Now to him who by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than all we can ask or imagine, to him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations forever and ever. So that's maybe enough. We got an hour in.
Yep.
An hour and 1 minute, actually. There you go. Thank you. Fun group to work with. I really appreciate you all. Thanks for coming back with me. It's good.